This is Intelligence Matters, sponsored by General Atomics Aeronautical Systems, the world leader in unmanned aircraft systems and makers of the affordable, scalable, and autonomous new collaborative combat aircraft.
This week, we look back at one of our best episodes of the year, a conversation I had with Chris Miller, a thought leader at the intersection of technology, geopolitics, and economics. Chris is an associate professor of international history at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. His New York Times bestselling book, Chip War: The Fight for the World's Most Critical Technology, has become a must-read for policymakers, national security professionals, CEOs, and anyone who wants to understand the global race for chip supremacy. We will be right back with a replay of that episode after a quick break. I'm Andy Makritis, and this is Intelligence Matters.
America must not fall behind in air dominance. That's why we need the Collaborative Combat Aircraft by General Atomics Aeronautical Systems. These new unmanned combat jets are affordable, scalable, and autonomous, and they partner with traditional combat formations to let American and allied pilots see first and act first. Our next-generation jets will let Washington retake the numbers advantage in the skies. For collaborative combat aircraft, rely on General Atomics Aeronautical, the world leader in unmanned aircraft systems. Learn more at UAV.com.
Welcome back. Chris, it's great to have you on the podcast. So just start with a funny story. You and I had never met until a few months ago when I was on a visit to Taiwan, and met you as we were both going to TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, which we'll be talking about. So, and one thing I discovered is you're a rock star out there, and what better place to meet the author of Chip War than at TSMC? So it just seemed like, fate or something. But welcome on the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
Chris, maybe we can just start out a level setting with some basics, just to make sure we're all sort of in the same place. Can we just talk a little bit about what the chips are that we're going to be referring to today, how they're made, and broadly why they matter? And then we'll get into more detail about that, but maybe we can just start there.
Well, a chip is a piece of silicon in most cases with thousands or millions, or in some cases billions of tiny circuits carved into them. And these circuits flip on and off, and they produce all of the ones and zeros that undergird all computing. And so today we've got chips not only in our phones and in our computers, but also in almost any device that has an on-off switch, from dishwashers to cars, which can have 1,000 chips inside of them, to planes and manufacturing equipment. So they're all around us, and they're increasingly relevant because they provide all of the new capabilities like connectivity and the ability to have automated features that we demand. And so when we think of chips today, we've got to not just think about computing, we've got to think about really all of the devices that we rely on.
Yeah, and so, I just read something not too long ago that just sort of suggested these are going to become throwaway. They'll be in virtually everything, and, on clothing and all manner of things, and they just become disposable when you're done with whatever that item is.
Well, and I think to an extent that's already true in some cases. It's extraordinary when you think of the number of devices that have chips inside of them. I have some young kids, and any toy that turns on and off, makes noises, for example, or has lights, there's almost always a chip inside of there. If you buy a new refrigerator, for example, there'll be a handful of chips inside of there. Electric toothbrushes have multiple chips inside of there, and so it really is devices that are often quite cheap that nevertheless rely on chips for many of the features that we today rely on.
So, Chris, let's talk a little bit about the big picture here, and maybe you could lay out for us the geopolitical landscape, and how you see that landscape shaping the semiconductor industry, because it clearly is.
Well, the first chips that were invented in the 1950s were made in the United States, in places like California and Texas, which were the centers of the early chip industry. But one of the key trends over the past couple of decades, which continues all the way up to the present, is the shifting of chip manufacturing from the United States to East Asia. And in particular today, Taiwan is the world's largest producer of cutting edge chips. And China is now the world's largest producer of the more commoditized foundational chips that you find in lots of different types of devices. So the entire industry now depends on manufacturing in a combination of Taiwan and China, which intersects in, I think, really problematic and even dangerous ways with the security dynamics that we see in East Asia. And the trend over the last couple of years has been that China and the United States have increasingly tried to reshape the chip industry as they've looked at the extent to which it's centered around the Taiwan Straits.
So, Chris, just to be clear, so you got the two primary players here, U.S., but not in a foundry kind of way. Maybe you can explain what a foundry is, and then actually three: U.S., Taiwan, PRC. Right? Is that the way you sort of look at this?
Yeah, I think it does help to break down the semiconductor supply chain, which is as complex as any supply chain that exists in the world. To produce almost any chip, you need inputs from dozens of different companies in multiple different countries, in Europe, US, Japan, and Taiwan and Korea often being the critical sources of high-tech inputs. And so if you want to make an advanced chip, you need ultra-specialized software that's usually produced in the United States. You need to design the chip so it does exactly what you want it to do. And US firms like NVIDIA or Qualcomm or AMD are the world's leaders in designing chips so they're the most efficient and capable. But the actual manufacturing depends on inputs from a bunch of other countries. The actual tools that make chips are partly produced in the United States, but also the Netherlands and Japan have a key role there. The chemicals that are used in making chips, which need to be purified to an extraordinary degree, are largely produced in Japan. And then it is Taiwan that is the most capable at bringing together all of these different components, taking the designs and actually undertaking the manufacturing at the precision level. And so when it comes to advanced chips, almost all of the key steps happen in the West. But when it comes to less advanced chips, China's got most of the capabilities that it needs domestically. And so China's a very, very large producer of these foundational chips, even though it can't produce cutting edge chips domestically.
Chris, can I just highlight something for our listeners? And maybe you can say a couple words about, that you just sort of talked about a complex supply chain. The role of the Netherlands and a particular company in the Netherlands seems to be outsized in this whole process. Can you just say a few words about that?
If you want to make an advanced chip, you need to undertake a process called photolithography, which is the process of printing shapes on a chip with rays of light. And today, the components on the chip in your smartphone, for example, or chips in your computer are so small, measured in billionths of a meter, that you can't manufacture them using traditional techniques. You've got to carve them using light. And so that's how chips are made. And there's one company in the world called ASML, based in the Netherlands, which produces the most advanced photolithography machines. So every advanced chip that's produced, the most advanced smartphone chips, the most advanced PC chips, the most advanced AI processors, are are created using this machine. And so ASML is a monopoly player. They're the only one in the world. And whether it's in Taiwan or in the US or in Korea, if you want to make a cutting edge chip at any sort of volume, you need these tools. And so that puts ASML in every chip company's supply chain. But it's also, I think, worth looking at ASML's supply chain. They're a Dutch company, but the key components in their machine are themselves sourced from around the world. And so to make these machines, and the most advanced versions of these machines cost $350 million. They're just extraordinarily complex. You've got to source components from Germany, where, for example, a company called Zeiss makes the flattest mirrors humans have ever made. That's one of the components in an ASML tool. But you also need to source components from the United States. And a portion of every ASML tool is manufactured in Connecticut. And so ASML is a Dutch company, but it's a Dutch company with a supply chain that itself stretches across Europe and the US. And that illustrates the interconnections and the mutual reliance that the semiconductor supply chain involves. It means that we've got reliance on the Netherlands and they've got reliance on us. And it has bound Western countries together technologically as well as politically.
Chris, let's just go back to China for a few minutes here. China's made achieving self-sufficiency in chip production a national priority. And we just touched on a little bit of the geopolitical landscape, but what does this ambition mean when you think about it in those terms and in a potential military application or implications, I should say?
Well, I think China has been focused on this issue of moving towards self-sufficiency now for almost a decade. In 2014, President Xi Jinping first described semiconductors as what he calls a core technology. And he did so, I think, for a couple of reasons. One was that China spends as much money each year importing chips as it spends importing oil. There's no product that today China is more reliant on the outside world for. And it imports primarily the more advanced chips that it can't produce domestically. And it's wanted to bring down that number to reduce its reliance on buying components from abroad. The second reason is that China realized that advances in computing require better chips. And if you think of artificial intelligence, the key input to advances in AI over the past decade has been better and better semiconductors produced by companies like NVIDIA. And China realized it didn't have any of these companies domestically. It was relying on foreign chips for its most significant high-performance computing applications. And that was significant for private sector tech companies, but also significant for defense and intelligence applications. And that's been the second driver of why China's wanted to try to build out this domestic self-sufficient ecosystem. And I think it's worth noting they've made real progress, especially on these lower end chips where China's production capacity is much, much larger than it used to be. But there are also still some real points of reliance on the West, both in terms of chip making tools, which China still has to import from countries like the Netherlands and like the United States, but also in terms of high end processors, which China still can't produce domestically at the level that, for example, TSMC can produce in Taiwan.
So, Chris, if this is, and these are my words, an economic Cold War between us and China, and you're a historian, you can differ and tell me if you do, but are there other parallels you see between the current situation and past geopolitical challenges, conflicts, frictions, that kind of thing?
Well, I think there are some parallels with the first Cold War in terms of the chip race. In the 1950s and 60s, the Soviet Union also invested very heavily in building out its own chip industry with the aim of having better guidance computers for its missile systems and its space capabilities. And it was involved in a whole amount of intellectual property theft and copying and smuggling of Western chips and equipment. And China's done much of the same. And I think there's another parallel with the Cold War, which is that the U.S. during the Cold War bet on computing capabilities, better communications, better sensors, better guidance systems to improve its military capabilities. And if you look at the trajectory of U.S. military power from, say, the 60s to the 1980s or 1990s, what you find is that the U.S. deployed computing across almost every type of defense system to improve its capabilities. And the U.S. is doing the same thing right now, talking about autonomous systems, asking about ways that it can bring to bear better sensors and communications systems. And so here, too, there's a parallel in terms of the linkage between better computing and efforts to develop military and intelligence capabilities. But the key difference, I think, with the Cold War is that in the first Cold War, the Soviet Union was relatively economically isolated. It didn't have a consumer market at home, and it wasn't linked up with international supply chains. Whereas until pretty recently, in the chip industry, China's had the ability to acquire almost whatever technology it wanted and to hire almost whoever it wanted internationally. And so today, if you look at China's chip industry, it's full of imported machines that are making chips, and it's full of workers who had spent time working in Singapore or in Taiwan or in the United States or elsewhere, who gained a lot of expertise while they were employed by international chip firms and have brought that back to China. And that gives China a real advantage, which the Soviet Union never had during the first Cold War.
So, Chris, at the center of a lot of this is TSMC. And we touched on that at the beginning, and you delve into it in your book, which, by the way, is just really a great read. How vulnerable are they? What are the potential challenges that could disrupt their dominance? Because now they're at and you might want to describe where they are at 3 nanometers, maybe going lower. Maybe you can give some context there too.
So TSMC was founded in 1987 with a unique business model, and its business model is really key to understanding why it's so dominant today. Before it was created, all chip companies both designed and manufactured chips in-house. They did both sides of the equation. TSMC has never designed any chips. It's only a manufacturer, and so it provides manufacturing services to many of the world's big tech companies, from chip designers like NVIDIA or Qualcomm, but also big tech companies that have their own in-house chip design arms, like Apple, which has an in-house chip design team that designs the processors inside of every iPhone. And TSMC produces for all these companies. And because of that, it's been able to scale up much larger than its competitors. And so it's the world's largest chip maker today because it has so many big customers. And there's a direct linkage between the scale, the number of chips it produces, and the technological capabilities. Because the more chips you produce, the more data you gather about your chip making capabilities, the more you can tweak your manufacturing process and make your manufacturing more efficient and more advanced. And so today, TSMC is by far the world's largest manufacturer of chips at what's called the 3 nanometer node, which is the most advanced production process in place today. And TSMC has, over the last decade, had the best track record of moving forward every single year with a dramatically more capable manufacturing process. And that's enabled it to win business from its competitors. And so today, the world's big tech companies can't exist without TSMC, whether it's Apple or NVIDIA. If you look at the largest companies on the US stock market, they depend, in many cases, exclusively on TSMC for their largest and most important processors. And that means that TSMC is, in a lot of ways, the world's most important manufacturing company, because the big tech firms couldn't persist without it. And that means it's got a position of both extraordinary advantage because it's at the center of this entire ecosystem. But it also means if something were to happen in the Taiwan Straits, it leaves the entire tech sector with this extraordinary vulnerability because there's no one who could quickly replace what TSMC can manufacture.
Now, TSMC has diversified, if you will. They're building facilities outside of Taiwan. But my assumption here is that the most advanced chips will probably still be produced in Taiwan and not in places like Japan. There's also a facility, and they're building in Phoenix, Arizona, and maybe other places. Is that right?
Yeah, that is right. In Japan and also in Germany, TSMC is building facilities that will produce chips that are fairly behind the cutting edge, that are be relevant for autos and industrial equipment, but won't be relevant for high-end processors. In Arizona, it's slightly different. TSMC is going to produce facilities that can manufacture chips that are 1 or 2 generations behind the cutting edge, so pretty close to the cutting edge. But TSMC has said they're going to keep all of their R&D in Taiwan, and they're going to keep all of their most advanced production capabilities in Taiwan as well. So when it comes to the cutting edge, that's going to remain in Taiwan, at least as far as TSMC is concerned. And the other part of the equation is the production volume, which matters just as much. And if you look at TSMC's investment plans, what you find is that it's true they're diversifying. They're building a bit in Japan, a bit in Germany, a bit more in Arizona. But the bulk of their production capacity, as far as we can see into the future, will remain in Taiwan. Something like 85% likely to be in Taiwan in 5 or 10 years' time. And so the diversification is real, but it's not large scale, and it doesn't significantly diminish the extent to which production in Taiwan will be very important for the rest of the world's technology companies.
So thinking about how important TSMC is, and the discussion we had a few moments ago about the complexity of the semiconductor supply chain. What potential disruptions do you see, and what are things that can be done to mitigate those? But clearly, if the world's relying on one company for all their advanced semiconductors, that's clearly a significant issue. But I'm sure there are others.
Well, when you start looking at the semiconductor supply chain, what you find is that there's a a number of different nodes in the supply chain where there's just one country, or in some cases one company, that has a dominant or even a monopolistic role. So ASML is another example. It's an absolute choke point. If something were to go wrong in the Netherlands, we would face significant disruptions to our ability to produce chips, because the machines that make chips would not be available. Now, I don't worry that much about the Netherlands. It's true that rising sea levels will eventually flood perhaps all the Netherlands, but we've got time to deal with that risk. And when it comes to earthquakes or geopolitics, I think the Netherlands is pretty safe. If you look at the chemicals that are used in chip making, a whole lot comes from Japan, where a number of Japanese firms like JSR or Shinetsu have absolutely unique capabilities. But again, I think Japan has proven itself to be a very reliable supplier, and there's not much concern there too. If you look at some of the basic materials in chip making, certain types of chips used for communications, for example, are made out of materials not like silicon, but gallium and germanium. And these are materials that are largely processed in China, where China's got 90% or so market share in the processing. And so China has, perhaps not surprisingly, threatened to restrict supply of these materials, which has caused prices of these materials to jump up internationally, because there's concerns that China might stop shipping at some point. So there's another potential choke point in the supply chain. But when you zoom out and say, where in the supply chain, in all of these different potential choke points where lots of things could potentially go wrong, where do you have both the largest magnitude of impact if something does get disrupted, and the probability of something happening? I think Taiwan is front and center in that calculus. And I think earthquakes help to illustrate the potential challenge. And Taiwan is, of course, in an earthquake-prone zone. And there's been a couple of big earthquakes in Taiwan over the past several decades that have disrupted, for just a couple of days, chip-making capabilities on the island. One pretty recently, which thankfully did not cause very much damage or loss of life. And then a bigger one in the 1990s, which did disrupt chip-making just for a couple of weeks. But this scale of chip making on Taiwan means that whenever there is a disruption, either due to an earthquake, which is a short run disruption usually, or due to something geopolitically driven, it means that there's no real way of insuring yourself, because there's no alternative to buying chips from Taiwan.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with Chris Miller.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
Chris, let me ask you, maybe it's an unanswerable question, but so how did we get here? How did we allow this, maybe one of the most critical technologies or capabilities, sort of get so dispersed and, and put ourselves in a situation where a supply chain for something like this is potentially fragile?
Well, I think there's a really strong economic logic to having extraordinary concentration in the chip industry. The simple reality is that the more concentration you have, the more efficiencies you can eke out of your supply chain. And so in Taiwan, they have the world's greatest density of chemical suppliers and material suppliers and experts on fixing this or that tool if it breaks. And TSMC, until very recently, with the new facilities abroad, has had almost all of its manufacturing centers within an hour and a half ride on the high-speed rail in Taiwan. And so you can have technicians zipping back and forth, fixing a problem in one facility and then addressing a different problem in a different facility the same day. And that has made TSMC the world's most efficient chip maker by far, by a wide margin. The challenge is that this efficiency developed at a time when there, I think, wasn't sufficient focus on the geopolitical dynamics around it. And in the 1990s and 2000s, when relations between China and Taiwan and China and the United States were in a lot of ways more stable. People more or less ignored the issue. But over the past couple of years, as these relations have deteriorated and as perceptions of risk have grown, people have begun to put together the fact that we're simultaneously worried about risk in this region and increasingly reliant on chips that TSMC produces so efficiently. And so right now, you've got governments essentially asking the industry to become less efficient in the name of providing more resiliency. And that's a really difficult thing to ask the industry to do. And that's why governments have had to come in and get involved both with regulation and with subsidies to change the way the supply chain is structured.
So along those lines, Chris, there's certainly growing conversation about reshoring, let's say chip production here in the US. We just talked about TSMC building in Arizona, Intel, others. Is this feasible given what you just described? Or is it we're going to have to learn to live with the situation as it is?
Well, I think it's a spectrum. And I think we've seen the CHIPS Act, which is going to devote around $40 billion to incentivizing more chip making facilities to be built in the U.S. That has had a real impact in terms of getting more companies to build in the United States. TSMC, Intel, Samsung, Texas Instruments, many others are building many new factories. And so we've seen a huge jump in the construction of new chip making facilities, more than 10x the rate of the prior decade. So that's having an impact. But it's going to have an impact over time. It's not like flipping a switch where you're reliant one day and you're not reliant the next day. We'd spent the last 3 decades building up capacity in Taiwan, and it's going to take decades to shift how the industry is structured. And so I think the CHIPS Act in the United States and similar efforts in Europe and Japan are adding resiliency to the supply chain. But right now, it's certainly not going to mean that we're anywhere close to self-sufficient or fully de-risked from Taiwan, just because all the capacity that's been built up in Taiwan is still there and still being used largely by Western firms.
Chris, one of the strengths of the West is alliances. And certainly the U.S. collaborates with allies in this industry, like many others. So can we touch on what you think some of the complexities are when addressing things like export controls, subsidies, other issues where maybe allies don't necessarily see eye to eye?
Well, I think the first challenge in de-risking is who are you de-risking from? The Taiwanese and to some extent the Koreans and Singaporeans say, well, you're talking about onshoring. That means more investment for you, but less investment for us. And that's a really complex conversation to have, especially with Taiwan, which sees TSMC and its broader chip industry as critical, both for its political significance, but also for pure economics, and is very worried about any effort to shift the chip supply chain outside of Taiwan. But I think the second challenge is working with allies like the Japanese, like the Netherlands, like Korea. When the U.S. wants to stop technologies from reaching China, it can certainly stop U.S. technologies or try to stop U.S. technologies from reaching China, but it also wants to stop technologies developed by foreign companies from reaching China. And so ASML, for example, has faced a series of restrictions, largely Dutch government restrictions, but Dutch restrictions that were encouraged by the United States that limit its ability to sell cutting-edge chip-making tools to China. The same thing with Japan. And in all these countries, I think the internal debate is pretty similar. Companies want to sell. That's their job. Their job is to sell tools and to sell chips, and they get unhappy when their governments prevent them from selling to customers, and China's a big customer. But also in all these countries, the security-focused parts of the government, the militaries, intelligence agencies, the national security bureaucracies, they're increasingly concerned about China's intentions and China's capabilities. And that set up a debate in all of these countries between business and the security establishment about what the right balance is to strike when it comes to technology export. And that debate has played out in the United States too, with chip companies unhappy about the fact that they can't sell cutting-edge chips to China, and the U.S. government essentially saying, well, too bad, our security depends on it.
Chris, if we just shift a bit and look a little bit towards the future and think about, beyond traditional silicon-based chips, what are the emerging technologies that you think will shape the industry? And then maybe in particular, because there's so much talk about artificial intelligence, and it's at the early stages of revolutionizing many sectors. How will the chip war impact the development and deployment of AI technologies?
Well, I think a lot of people don't realize the extent to which advances in AI have been largely driven by advances in semiconductors. Moore's law, which says that the computing capabilities of cutting edge chips doubles roughly every 2 years, has continued all the way up to the present, which means that compared to 2 years ago, we've got chips that are roughly twice as good. And if you look at the trend in AI systems, AI researchers refer to this as the scaling laws, which means that as you scale up a system, train it on more data, you get comparably better performance. And that trend has proven true over the last decade. And the big AI companies from OpenAI to Google to Anthropic are all betting that it's going to continue for the foreseeable future. And that means they're going to want to train AI systems on more and more data, which means they're going to need more and more processing power and therefore better and better chips to undertake that training. And that basic dynamic is why NVIDIA today is the world's second largest company. Because everyone wants access to these ultra cutting edge AI chips, which are critical to training bigger and better AI systems. And if you look historically over the last decade, and there's been some great researchers who have done this quantitatively and ask what share of AI advances have come from just better chips, raw processing power, versus algorithms that are designed to more efficiently process. And you try to break out quantitatively whether it's algorithmic efficiency or just processing power that's driving AI advances. The best research suggests that it's overwhelmingly processing power that has driven advances thus far. And that's why you can hear people like Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, talk about how he envisions needing $7 trillion of computing infrastructure over the coming years to build the AI systems that he wants to build. That's chips, that's servers, that's data centers, that's the power that data centers require. But that fundamentally is providing the processing power that he thinks his AI capabilities are going to need. Now, you could say that's the right number, that's the wrong number, but I think that gives you a sense of the scale that AI experts are envisioning spending on computing power. And computing power means better and better chips. And that, I think, is why when you look at AI today, you've got to look hard at the semiconductors that make it possible. And there's just a tiny number of companies that are providing the chips that are central to AI. It's NVIDIA designing the chips, and it's TSMC largely producing the chips. And, ironically, for AI, Taiwan's role is even more important than in any other segment of the chip industry. Almost all cutting edge GPU chips, or the chips that are used for AI training, are manufactured in Taiwan. And so that just tells us that the chip industry and its structure will be, I think, absolutely central in shaping how AI systems develop and are deployed.
Does quantum computing, which works in a different way, does that, and I realize quantum computers would be for sort of a niche, specialized niche, everyone's not going to have one in their home. But does that change this equation in any way, or not really?
I think in some ways it's too soon to tell, because we're just at the cusp, I think, of getting our first practically usable quantum computers. But I guess I'm struck by two things. I think, first, if you look historically at big revolutions in computing, what you find is that even really revolutionary technologies like the invention of the first chips, the first computers, they take years, if not decades, to fully disseminate throughout an economy and throughout society. And so I think quantum computing, when it emerges, will actually take some time for us to find all of the use cases and to get different institutions and different users embracing quantum capabilities. The second interesting thing is that a lot of the companies developing quantum capabilities, and there's a bunch of different paradigms being explored, but a lot of them envision very closely tying quantum with classical computing, high-powered classical computing. And I think that suggests that, at least in its early stages, we should think of quantum not as a replacement to traditional high-performance computing, but rather as a supplement to high-performance computing and AI capabilities that we use today. It'll be used for slightly different types of things, but it's going to be used alongside traditional high-powered data centers. And so quantum will be, I think, revolutionary at some point, but it might not feel like a real revolution in the early stages because it's going to be so closely integrated with the rest of our computing infrastructure.
So, Chris, let me just sort of zoom out and ask you like a 30,000-foot question, and that's, what, in your view, should be the long-term U.S. strategy for chip technology? What might that look like?
Well, I think if you look historically, since the invention of modern computing up to the present, the US has been by far the world's greatest beneficiary of advances in computing. Every aspect of our economy has been transformed by the application of computing. The biggest tech companies in the world are all US companies. And so I think fundamentally our goal should be to continue driving forward advanced computing capabilities on the thesis that historically we've reaped the most benefits. And I think if you look into the future, that's likely to persist. And so that's got to be front and center, keeping that rate of advance alive, keeping it going as far as we can see. And that's something that's not inevitable. That requires real hard work, and that requires funding dollars to go into the types of R&D that are exploring new computing architectures and new manufacturing capabilities and new materials, which are necessary to make better and better chips. So I think that's got to be the primary focus. There has been an emerging focus the last couple of years on simultaneously trying to prevent adversaries from getting access to these capabilities too. And I think that's important. And the export control regimes that have been put in place, I think, are directionally right. But I think we also shouldn't lose perspective of the fact that in this race, I think 90% of the outcome of the race will be determined by who's running faster, and only 10% will be determined by who's preventing their competitors from getting access to this or that technology. And I do worry that in our public discussion, there's a lot of focus on the slowing down China aspect and not nearly enough focus on what are we doing to keep ourselves racing forward.
That's a great point. I guess that also brings up the specter of education. And we have a lot of students who listen to the podcast, both undergraduate and graduate students. What would you say to them as they think about this chip-enabled world that we're in and will be even deeper in, as they get out into the workforce?
Well, I think that over the past couple of decades, when we thought of technology, our minds have turned to social media or to smartphone apps or to search engines, and those have all been generally good in their own ways, and certainly extraordinary companies have been built on top of them. But I think we collectively as a society and as we think about technology, we've understated the importance of better hardware and better semiconductors in driving that. And I guess I am somewhat encouraged by the fact that over the last couple of years, there's been a renewal of interest in the hardware capabilities, the manufacturing advances, the material science improvements that undergird all of the software advances that we take for granted. And the fact that some of the technology leaders who are in the news most frequently, whether it's Elon Musk or Sam Altman, are spending a whole lot of their time talking about chips, getting access to chips, designing their own chips, even potentially manufacturing their own chips. That to me is encouraging, because it does suggest a rebalancing of our interests. Obviously, software is important, computer engineering is important, but I think we've underplayed the significance of the manufacturing advances that ultimately undergird all computing. And I think a bit of that rebalancing is happening, but we need to do a bit more rebalancing. And that is relevant for students too, because when you're thinking of what do I want to focus on in my education, I think we've got to make sure we got students thinking hard about the types of capabilities and the types of expertise that are necessary for making better hardware and better manufacturing too.
Chris, let me just one last question. You're a historian. How did you get involved in this? All right, this seems like there's a bit of a jump here. Can you sort of tell the audience how you got involved in thinking about chips and then writing the book?
Well, my background is in Russian history. That's my area of academic expertise. And I wanted to understand at first why during the Cold War, the United States was able to develop such a large technology ecosystem while the Soviet Union basically failed to do so. Despite that, if you look at the early Cold War, the Soviets were the first in space. They had the first satellite. They put lots of money behind their technology development programs. They had many brilliant scientists, Nobel Prize winning physicists and chemists, and a lot of the inputs that one might think would be necessary to build a successful technology base were in the Soviet Union that they failed. And that seemed to me like a puzzle. And the more I dug into it, the more I realized that actually computing was the factor that was most determinative of the outcome of the Cold War, and yet we talked about the least. And it seems to me that that's not just a trend historically, it's a trend that's playing out today. The ability to harness computing power, deploy computing power is absolutely the center of certainly geopolitics with the U.S.-China competition, but also in terms of technology and economic progress as well. And so I got interested in this question of how do we produce computing, because it seemed to me that you couldn't actually understand any of the key trends in the world today without understanding this. And so that's why I decided to write a book explaining why chips are so important and how it is that we've come to be so reliant on them.
Chris, this has been a fascinating discussion. Thanks so much for taking the time to be on the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
That was Chris Miller. I'm Andy McCreadis. Please join us next week for another episode of Intelligence Matters. And you can always reach us at intelligencematterspod@gmail.com.
Intelligence Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry and Sophia Rubin. Intelligence Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.